Johnny Tremain, Chapter 11, Yankee Doodle. I just want to first say thanks for everybody that's joining, those that are in my class at Hozho, but then also those that are just watching on YouTube. I'm glad that you have found this and that it's been helping you all read this book. And sorry for the delay of getting this out. My second baby boy was just born, and so if you can hear his noise in the background, I do apologize, but hopefully it won't be too distracting as we try to finish this book together. As I said at the beginning, we're getting into Chapter 11, Yankee Doodle. We have two more chapters of Johnny Tremain, so let us dive in. So Johnny slept. It was daylight when he woke with Warren's hand upon his shoulder. Outside in Tremont Street, he could hear the clumping of army boots. A sergeant was swearing at his men. The soldiers were paraded so close to the house, which stood flush with the sidewalk-less street, that Johnny at first thought they must be in the room. Dr. Warren dared speak no louder than a whisper. "I'm going. Something's happened." Yes, he motioned Johnny to follow him into that kitchen. This room was on the back of the house. They could talk without danger of being overheard by the troops in the street. Dr. Warren had on the same clothes as the day before. He had not been to bed, but now his hat was on his head. His black bag of instruments and medicines was packed and on the table. Silently, he put milk, bread, herrings beside it, and gestured to Johnny to join him. "Where did it begin?" asked Johnny. "Lexington." "Who won?" "They did. 700 against 70. It wasn't a battle. It was just target practice. For them, some of our men were killed, and the British huzzaed and took the road to Concord." "And did they get our supplies there?" "I don't know. Paul Revere sent for me just after the fire in Lexington Green." The young man's usual fresh-colored face was haggard. He knew the seriousness of this day for himself and for his country. But everywhere the alarm is spreading. Men are grabbing their guns, marching for Concord. Paul Revere did get through in time last night. Billy Dawes a little later. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Minutemen are on the march. Before the day's over, there'll be real fighting, not target practice. But Gage doesn't know that it's begun. You see, long before Colonel Smith got to Lexington, just as soon as he heard that Revere had warned the country, he sent back for reinforcements. For Earl Percy, you and I, Johnny, are just about the only people in Boston who know that blood has already been shed. Were many killed at Lexington? No, not many. They stood up, just a handful. The British fired on them. It was dawn. Johnny licked his lips. Did they tell you the name of those killed? No. Did Rab get out in time? Yes, last Saturday. The doctor's clear, blue eyes darkened. He knew what was in Johnny's mind. He picked up his bag. "I've got to get to them. They'll need surgeons. Then, too, I'd rather die fighting than on gallows. Gage won't be so lenient now. Soon as he learns war has begun." "Wait until I get my shoes on." "No, Johnny, you're to stay here today. Pick up for me any information. For instance, out of my bedroom window, I can see soldiers standing the length of the street way over to the common. You find out what regiments are being sent and all that. And today, go about and listen to what folk are saying and the names of any British arrest. We know Gage expects to move his men back here tonight. If so, there'll be a lot of confusion getting them into town. You watch your chance and slip out to me. Where'll I find you? God knows. Ask about. I will do so. They've begun it. We'll end it. But this war, may last quite a long time." They shook hands silently. Johnny knew that Warren was always conscious of the fact that he had a crippled hand. Everybody else had accepted and forgotten it. The back door closed softly. Warren was gone. Johnny went to the surgery, put on his boots and jacket. The wall clock said 8 o'clock. It was time to be about. There was no leaving by the front door. The soldiers were leaning against it. Through the curtains of the windows, he could see the muskets. He noticed the facings on their uniforms. The 23rd Regiment. The narrow course of Tremont Street was filled to the brim and overflowing with the waiting scarlet-coated men, like a river of blood. He left by the kitchen. On Cornhill, Johnny could feel the subdued excitement. Everyone knew something was happening. No one knew what. Doors and windows were open. People hanging out, calling back and forth or gathered in knots in the street. Johnny kept his eyes and ears open. Everyone knew about that secret expedition last night. Colonel Smith had embarked with 700 men and landed in Cambridge. That Gage was sending over at least 1,000 fresh troops to support him, anyone might guess. But the people of Boston knew no more than Gage that the fighting had begun. Johnny went to the Province House. All was as usual. The sentries were on guard. Young officers lounged about. One was already in his cups. Johnny could see that a group of them were playing at cards in the south parlor. Perhaps they were finishing off the game they had begun last night. He knew... One second. He knew which was General Gage's bedroom. The curtains were still drawn. Colonel Smith's early call for reserves evidently had not upset the commanding officer. He had given the order which set Percy's 1st Brigade in motion, had rolled over and gone to sleep. Johnny went to the common. He had already seen the tale of Percy's brigade lashing around Dr. Warren's house. The head of this scarlet dragon lay upon the common. The men were restless, grumbling, spitting, shifting their heavy equipment. Some had already been standing about for 3 hours. Johnny learned from one of their camp women what was causing the delay. They were waiting to be joined by a detachment of Marines. He looked about and saw for himself these 1,200 men were talking with them cannon and baggage weapons. The tension among the inhabitants was growing. What had happened? What was going to happen? Shops and schools were closed, and Johnny met a wreath of tiny children advancing and chanting, "School's done, war's begun." It looked to him they were shrewder guessers than their elders who were trying to believe that not a shot had been or would be fired. Then from over North Boston came the brisk rattle of drums. The 500 Marines belayed all about North Square, around a double quick. They took their places in the ranks. Some were still buckling their equipment or eating the bread that had been tossed to them. They had been hours late, but when they had been notified, they came fast. Tagging after them, looking half awake and half dressed, Johnny recognized an old acquaintance. It was Madge, even fatter since her marriage and seemingly more in love than ever. Tears streamed down her thick, red cheeks, and all old animosity forgotten. She flung herself upon Johnny. "I can't bear it, but he says he's got to go." Nearby tough, little Sergeant Gale was strutting about like a bantam cock, roaring at one of his men whose buttons did not shine. He was pretending not to know that his wife was so nearby. He was really showing off in front of her and approved her presence. Men went to war and women wept. All was as it should be. "Sure he's got to go," Johnny comforted Madge. "But people say Gage is just sending out the brigade for exercise. They've been sitting around about barracks catching fleas all winter. Why were the Marines late?" "Gage sent a letter to Major Pitcairn telling him to parade his men, but Pitcairn wasn't to be home. Pitcairn went off last night, second in command to Colonel Smith. Did you know that? The Marines didn't know it until about 2 minutes ago." Johnny had to laugh. It certainly would hearten Dr. Warren when he heard how stupid the British had been. Gage had forgotten the Marine Major had already gone. He sent him a letter and then turned over for another snooze. Suddenly there was silence along the whole great length of the brigade. Slim Earl Percy, on a white horse, escorted by a group of officers, was cantering slowly across the common. 5 mounted men. The sun was bright that day, with only breeze enough to ruffle the horses' manes. Flaunt scarlet riding capes, float the flag of England. Johnny was an Englishman, the sullen, rebellious people standing about, watching Percy and his staff approaching, waiting for the brigade to march. All were Englishmen. That flag, it stood for Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, Charles I, head upon a block, centuries of struggle for English liberty. But over here, there had grown up a broader interpretation of the word liberty. No man to be ruled or taxed except by men of his own choice. But we are still fighting for English liberty. And don't you forget it. French slaves to the north of us, Spanish slaves to the south of us. Only English colonies are allowed to taste the forbidden fruit of liberty. We who grew up under England, Johnny thought of James Otis' words, upholding the torch of liberty, which had been lighted on the fires of England. Not since the soldiers had come to Boston had Johnny removed his hat. When the British flag went by, except once, when it had been knocked off his head by a soldier. He started to remove it now, for the first time and doubtless the last. Thought better of it. It was too late. He knew the shooting had begun. The sword in Earl Percy's hand flashed. There was a command which was instantly picked up and repeated and echoed and repeated again. The regimental drummers struck up. The artillery horses threw their weight against their collars. Wagoners cracked their whips, and the Scarlet Dragon swung forward, sluggishly at first, heading for the town gates. Thousands of separate feet merged into only one gigantic pair. Left, right, left, right. The earth shook to their rhythm. Johnny watched them pass. Every button was sewed on, every buckle in place, every cartridge box held exactly 36 cartridges. Sorry, guys. Every musket had a bayonet, and there was not one old fowling piece among them. Every horse had 4 new shoes. It was a magnificent sight, but Johnny felt a little sick. What chance, what shadow of a chance, had those poor, untrained, half-armed farmers at Concord? Oh God, be with us now. But even as he prayed, he kept an eye out for the regimental markings on the men's uniforms. It was the 4th, the 23rd, and the 47th who were being sent out, plus 500 Marines, plus a small artillery train and a few baggage weapons. 1,200 for a guess. The drums throbbed. The heavy dragon marched on its thousands of feet, and now above the drums came the shrilling of the fifes. They played a tune they always played when they wished to insult Yankees. For once more, Yankee Doodle was going to town on a spanking stallion, with that forlorn feather in his cap, asking those unmilitary questions. Poor Yankee Doodle. Whatever could he do against this great scarlet dragon? The hundreds gathered to see the departure of the brigade stood about gazing at the empty space they had occupied. Far away, growing faint and fainter, came wafting back the last sound of the tune they played. A man standing by Johnny with clenched hands and head thrust down and out like a bull's said thickly, "They go out by Yankee Doodle, but they'll dance to it before night." Johnny saw a group of women, and they were nodding their heads, whispering a prophecy. Before night, they'll be dancing. This catchphrase was everywhere. It did not seem to have gone from mouth to mouth, but from mind to mind. Old meeting struck 9. Earl Percy and his laggard brigade was gone. This day, this unreal day in which Boston waited hour upon hour for news, any news, good or bad, was well begun. Suddenly, people were saying, "Have you heard? At sunrise this morning over at Lexington, the British fired on us." No one seemed to know where this rumor had started, but it was everywhere. Although half of Gage's forces had left town for the battlefield, there were more officers than usual hanging about the streets and taverns, and their faces were so bland, and they reassured the people so glibly that not a shot had been fired, not a person killed, and begged all and sundry so smoothly to keep calm and go to their shops or their homes. Johnny was confident that the British as well as the inhabitants had heard now that the war had begun. And by new little bands of soldiers appeared on the streets, going quickly from house to house. Too late, General Gage had given orders that the leaders of the opposition should be arrested. But the leaders were all gone. The angry, frustrated soldiers might scare Sam Adams' black handmaiden out of her wits. They could break John Hancock's fence. But these gentlemen had quietly left Boston a month before. They stormed into Joseph Worm's house. He was gone, and so was Paul Revere. Not one of the principal leaders was left, and seemingly no rebel printers. Isaiah Thomas's shop was empty. He and his press had left the night before. At Eads and Gill's, where the Boston Gazette was published, they did grab young Peter Eads. His father and press had been smuggled out to Watertown. Robert Newman, suspected of having hung the lanterns in Christ Church the night before, was thrown into jail, and John Poling, merely suspected of having helped, was forced to hide in his grandmother's wine butt. Paul Revere's cousin was in jail, and every minute the temper of the soldiers was growing shorter, and a queer feeling of jubilation was apparent among the people. You couldn't see, you couldn't guess why they began feeling so confident. Confidence was in the air. As soon as Johnny heard that arresting parties were on the streets, he sent a message to Uncle Lorne. Uncle had best make himself scarce. Soon after, having stood about the jail and noted exactly who was put in it, he himself headed for Salt Lane. There was not a person on the street, but at every window he saw a face. The lane itself had changed. He glanced about him and saw what was wrong. There was no little man in a blue coat observing Boston through a spyglass. The familiar sign had been torn down, stamped kindling. The door of the shop was shattered. He went in. The presses were broken. The type pied. Upstairs, his and Rab's bed had been ripped upon by bayonets. Frightened, he ran across the street. Aunt Jennifer sat in her kitchen. Half in her lap and half on the floor was an enormous feather bed. She was peacefully sticking on a new ticking. The only unusual thing was the great number of feathers this deft housewife had carelessly spilled over her kitchen floor. Rabbit, enchanted with these new toys, was constantly picking up a feather, putting it in his hair, and saying, "Yankee-doo." "They've been here?" asked Johnny. "Yes. Are they gone?" "No, not one in sight. We got your message just as they were turning down Salt Lane." The feather bed began to heave on the floor. "You can come out now," Aunt Jennifer whispered to it. Out of the bottom rolled Uncle Lorne, choked with feathers and looking more bird than human. Rabbit shrieked, "Da-da!" He evidently thought his father much improved. Still trembling, for Uncle Lorne was a timid man, he kissed his wife and hugged his child. "It was all I could think of," Aunt Jennifer said to Johnny. "Mr. Lorne just stood here and said he wasn't afraid to die. We could hear the men marching down the street. It was terrible, so I just popped him in and went on sewing." "Were the soldiers rough?" "Rough? They were furious." "Good," said Johnny grimly. "That means they are really scared. Something pretty awful has happened to all those men Gage has sent out. Some of the officers may know already, but the men have guessed it, and they are running about with uniforms unbuttoned and yelling. If they want a war, we'll give it to them. And they won't pay taxes, we'll collect in blood. And what they won't pay in taxes, we'll collect in blood." "You don't say. Are you sure the fight's going for us?" "Pretty sure. I was down by the ferry slip and saw a British major coming over from Charleston. Well, he in a civilian coat over his uniform, sort of disguised, and he tore off the boat and he ran for the province house. He'd come to tell Gage Colonel Smith's and Percy's men are getting licked." "Boy, you're jumping at conclusions." "Not I. I saw his face. It was just done in and tied up with disgust. His uniform was a mess. His feelings had been hurt. People who have been winning battles don't go around with faces like that. But British officers who have been beaten by peasants and yokels do. Oh, Johnny, I do like to hear you talk like that, but I'm not counting much on one man's face. Where are you off to?" "Beacon Hill. I have an idea." That major got back to Gage to tell him one thing. "The British are going to try to get to Charlestown, just the way he did, and under protection of the Somerset's guns. They won't backtrack the way they came. Too dangerous. If I have guessed it right, before long from Beacon Hill, we'll be able to see them running, and our men after them. Johnny, here's half a mince pie for you. You're a real smart boy." Uncle Lorne came back from the bedroom, where he, with Rabbit's help, had been picking off feathers. "Even if they hang me," he said in a proud tremolo, "I will feel I have not lived in vain." He was still pretty scared. Out on the street, Johnny met officers yelling at their men, trying to get them back into their barracks, striking at them even with the flat of their swords. You couldn't say the British regulars lacked fight. All they could talk about was how many sulking cowards and damned rebels they were going to kill, and one day all was changed in Boston. On both sides, the gloves were off, and the hands underneath were bloody. War had begun. The pastures and orchards back of Beacon Hill were crowded, and all eyes turned northward. Johnny was not the only person who had guessed that Percy would not attempt to get the remains of Smith's troops and his own brigade back through Cambridge, but only to Charlestown, where they could be protected by the Somerset's guns. Then Johnny saw running down Cambridge Road through the bushes on Charlestown Common a scurry of red ants. Had he really seen them or imagined them? But all about him people were exclaiming, "Look, there they are!" Those red ants were British soldiers. To his left, the last moment of sunset light was dying. The day had been amazingly warm, but with night a fresh breeze came up off the ocean. Lights began to glimmer in Charlestown and on warships. Seemingly, there was nothing more to be seen from Beacon Hill. Silently, people turned to go to their houses. "Look!" Johnny cried. You could see the flash of musket fire, too far away to be heard. Fireflies swarming, hardly more than that. Getting 2,000 men, or what was left of them, for gossip was saying they had been well chewed, into boats and back to Boston would create just the confusion Dr. Warren had promised. But it would not be easy for Johnny to slip over. The soldiers were cross and frightened. He would wait a little until they were more relaxed, say about midnight. Before him, lighted from top to bottom, he saw the Lights house, and he remembered Pumpkin's uniform. Dressed in that, he might slip aboard in the confusion. He went to the Lights. In front of the house, he saw wagons and carts, and men loading them with furniture, chests, trunks, boxes, even old portraits. The Lights were moving, and by night, in a hurry, he went to the kitchen door. Mrs. Bessie, who certainly ought to have been superintending this moving, was sitting idly in the kitchen, doing nothing. Scylla sat beside her. She was doing nothing. Mrs. Bessie jerked her thumb toward the front of the house. "Scared?" she said. "They are all going to London until this insurrection, as they call it, is over. The Unicorn leaves at dawn tomorrow. Gage has given permission." "Scylla," said Johnny, Don't you go with them." "Never. We all had a terrible fight this afternoon. when word first came that us Yankees had beaten them hollow. All the other servants are Tories and are going with them. But Mrs. Bessie and I are Whigs, and we are not going with them. In the end, Mr. Light said he was glad we are Whigs because he will leave us here to look after his property. Gage has promised nothing up here will be touched. But they don't want us around. Can't bear the sight of us, Mrs. Bessie said smugly. The very sight of a good Whig makes them furious. Mr. Light did have another fit, just a little one. Miss Lavinia is afraid. If she doesn't get her papa right out of town and off to London, he'll die. She always did like London better than Boston anyway. They are leaving tonight, and fast. What's a Santa going to do? Is he? Mrs. Bessie's lips curled. She'll go with him. She will not, said Scylla. Miss Lavinia has gone down to Hancock's Wharf to ask Ma to let her take her, but Ma couldn't give her away, just as though she was a kitten. Miss Lavinia was standing in the doorway from the dining room to the kitchen. She had on a black cloak with the hood to it over her head. She stood a moment looking about and said nothing. Johnny was on his feet. He knew he would never forget her, never. Even when he was an old man, he would remember Lavinia Light standing framed in that doorway, saying nothing. Her eyes were angry and tired. The chisel mark was deep between the low, sweeping black brows. He had never seen her look so worn and old, and never been more aware of her beauty. Santa's going with me, she said at last. Your mother, Scylla, has too many kittens. Miss Lavinia, said Scylla, you can't do that. Can't? Your mother signed the paper, and you're a wicked girl to stand in the way of your sister's good fortune. A little diffidently, Santa herself emerged from behind the lady's great dark skirts. Santa, said Scylla gently, you can't go off and leave me like this. It's no matter what mother says. Look, dear, if you go to London, maybe you will never come back, Santa. Don't go away from me. Lavinia was smiling on her dark hood. I will leave the decision entirely to her. She shall be perfectly free to choose between us, precious. Would you rather go with me to London and be a great lady and wear silks and jewels and ride in coaches, or stay here and be just another poor working girl? And then, to make the choice doubly hard for the child, she added a little maliciously, which do you love most, Scylla or me? Still, Santa said nothing, but even in her silence, Johnny could detect something of her desire for drama. At that moment, silence was more dramatic than anything she could say. Izzy is no good, thought Johnny. She'll go. Scylla was standing quietly, well away from the child. She was too proud to make any further appeal to her. Perhaps, like Johnny, she knew what the answer would be. Well, said Lavinia, I haven't got all day. Which do you love the most? Santa began to cry. It was perfectly natural crying. Not even Johnny could believe it was done for effect. I don't know, she sobbed. Which would you rather be, a common person like your sister or a fine lady? Fine lady, she sniffed and went on dreamingly. And I'll have a gray pony and a pony cart. I've got the gold locket already. Her hand went to her throat. Next she'd be saying she wanted a little sailboat. Even now she was only reflecting old desires of Scylla's. Santa never could think up anything for herself. Yes, dear, you will. When I am Lady Morton, and you, my little protege, she explained to the others, I've been betrothed to marry my lord ever since I last came back from London. Papa is a very sick man. He could never live through a civil war over here. Never. He doesn't want to leave all his property to the mob. But what does it matter? My lord is so rich. This miserable house or ships, shops are nothing to him. And my lord never liked it that my papa was in the trade. Until now, papa would not give up his trade, nor could I bear to leave him. She turned to Scylla. And I promise you, I will be in a position to give your sister the best care and training. Training, said Johnny. What's she going to be trained for? Santa shall be an actress. I would have been myself, but my station in life prevented me. And then I am too tall, and besides, I can't act. Santa shall be the toast of London. You'll be proud some day. Even over here in this dreary wilderness, you shall hear her name and boast that once you knew her. Mrs. Bessie said smartly, I'd welcome the day I was proud to know that Izzy. Scylla was not taking the parting as hard as Johnny would have expected. Now he knew that she had been through the worst of it months before, when first the two sisters had come to the lights. She had lost to Santa long ago. Now, Scylla, said Miss Lavinia, I want you to have some time alone with Santa. You've been a good girl, Scylla, better than Santa, but happens she is what I fancy. Now go with her and help her pack her duds. Scylla said nothing, but curtsied and went upstairs with Santa, who was once more sobbing. You too, said Lavinia irritably to Mrs. Bessie. You leave me, for I must talk to Johnny alone. Miss Bessie heaved herself up out of her comfortable chair and shut the door after her. The young woman sat at last and murmured more to herself than to Johnny. I must talk to you, Jonathan Light Tremain. Johnny raised his eyes in amazement. I want to tell you before we left. First of all, Papa never meant to trick you out of your cup. He honestly thought it was an attempt at swindle. I mean that someone here in Boston stole the cup and then found a boy to pretend to be a long-lost relative and use the cup as proof. Your mother did leave Boston with one of those cups. Papa did not mention that fact in court. There really were 5. He implied no more than 4 ever came to this country. He didn't imply it, Johnny said. He swore it on court. Oh, well, what of it? Let me talk. You see, he never knew that his niece, Vinnie Light, had a child. He had it from your father's family, that both she and her husband died of cholera almost as soon as they reached Marseille. You see, your father was a naval surgeon, a prisoner of war, while here in Boston. Oh, nothing very much, she added scornfully. No great fortune or title, and Vinnie Light fell in love with him. Excuse me, guys, sorry. He was everywhere in society that year, although a prisoner of war, and of course the Lights wouldn't hear of a marriage. He a Frenchman and a Catholic, and they told her if she ran off with him, she would be cut off, and she was never to return. But she did. Vinnie was so wild, she went right ahead. A ship's captain married them. Then his family, of course, would have none of her, she being a heretic, and then he died. They sent word to Papa your grandfather was dead, that both had died, but his family sent Vinnie to a convent, hoping the sisters would convert her, and there, 3 months after your father died, you were born. You were born in a convent in the south of France. Odd, isn't it? Why do you call my mother Vinnie? We all did. Vinnie Light, the wildest, handsomest girl in Boston. I was only a schoolgirl, but she was so beautiful and so gay. Oh, if you could have but seen her. But I did. He remembered the sweet, sad face of his sick mother. Was the wild and beautiful Vinnie Light really that same woman? His mother patiently sewing to keep life in her son's body. She wanted no more life for herself, teaching him to read, making him those smocks, knowing she had changed so much in such a few years. She dared, as Mrs. Tremain returned to Boston, so her boy could grow up here, learn a decent trade. He thought of her agreeing with Mr. Lapham for his indenture, smiling as she told him that when she died, he was to go there. When I first saw you, Miss Lapham went on, I noticed one thing, but it sent me thinking. I did nothing for a while, but this spring I asked one of my father's captains, bound for Marseille, to fill about and find out the truth. I did so behind Papa's back. Papa was already too ill to be bothered, but I knew he would want to do it right. Like swearing in court, there never were but 4 light cups. She colored angrily. Please let me do the telling. Don't you dare criticize the best man ever lived. Johnny had his own opinion on that. What was the one thing, he asked. The way your hair turns down upon your forehead, that little peak. She was a dark girl. That widow's peak on her was very striking. And then that day in Mr. Dana's court, I did notice you walked like her, light and wild, like a panther. Or she shrugged. Maybe only like a tomcat. I admired my cousin, so I may tend to exaggerate her qualities. And what did your captain find out? What I have just told you, and one thing more. Your father, the naval surgeon, was ashamed to be a prisoner of war. He told folks here his name was Latour. That's why your name, Tremain, meant nothing to us. That is my true name? Yes, but I haven't much time to talk. Only yesterday I told Papa. He's too ill to speak to you himself. He does want you to know that he did not deliberately cheat you, steal your cup. Mother did take it with her? Yes, it belonged to her, and her maid, Miss Denny, went with her. It was Margaret Denny who got her and you out of the convent and onto a ship her brother commanded, and so to Townsend, Maine. That's where I grew up. I remember Aunt Margaret. She died just before Mother took me to Boston. Yes, and Papa says I'm to promise you that he will write the whole thing out in black and white when the war's over. She shrugged. You can put it in quite a claim for property. If there's any property left, which I doubt, anything more you wish to ask me? Yes, what relationship are you to me? What I ought to call you? She laughed out loud. Mercy, I don't know. What am I? Why am I suppose I'm sort of a cousin, but you'd better call me Aunt Lafinia, and said it tentatively. Aunt Lafinia? You couldn't even secretly have a romantic passion for an aunt. The queer hold she had on him for a year snapped. She went to Johnny, stretched out a hand, and touched the widow's peak. all that he had ever got from the beautiful Vinnie Light. Then she was gone. Johnny almost forgot the principal reason for his visit to the lights. He would have liked to sit quietly for a moment, brood over what Miss Latvina had told him. Now was not the time to brood. Scylla and Mrs. Bessie came back together. He told them he must have Pumpkin's uniform. Miss Bessie said he was not to think of such a thing. If they catch you, Johnny, they will shoot you for impersonating a British soldier in wartime. Lots of better men got shot today. Lexington, Concord. The British are sending boats back and forth tonight, taking off their men from Charleston. I can sneak along with them. No, I forbid you, Johnny. You're going to stay right here and help Scylla and me look after this house. I've got to go. Who's going to look out for the light horses if you walk out on us? General Gage has given his word no person or horse or any household gear will be touched, but we need a man to mind the stable. Johnny had an idea. Scylla, there's a thing you can do for me. What? Go to the African Queen and get my goblin. Take him up here and turn him out to the pasture with the light horses. I guess he won't mind being a Tory for a while. Can I ride him? Yes, if you don't mind falling off. I don't mind. She looked excited and pleased. Mrs. Bessie shook her head. And who's to care for the animals? You adding your goblin makes things worse, not better, for us two womenfolk. The coachman's going with the lights? Of course. He's English-born. Look here, Mr. Lorne, the printer, he's not what you'd call a coachman, but he was reared on a farm and he's in trouble. British haven't arrested him yet? He hid in a feather bed, but he can't stay there until we've driven the British out of Boston. Couldn't he and his wife and child move up here into the coachman's quarters and you sort of act as though he had always worked here? Of course they could. I'd be proud to have them. So just as soon as the unicorn sails, you go to the Lornes and tell him to come right up and settle in. The girl nodded. Johnny said, if he can't get his little press to working again, I think he might like to bring that with him. Go on with his sedition, as they call it. He just about has to print. We can handle the press, his press too. Nobody would dare hunt here for sedition, not after what Gage promised. He'll be a very happy man. And now I've got to go. Syl, where's that uniform of Pumpkin's? I hid it under my bed. I'll fetch it down. Mrs. Bessie shook her head, but she wasn't going to argue anymore. How old are you, Johnny? She asked. 16. And what's that, a boy or a man? He laughed. A boy in time of peace and a man in time of war. Well, men have got the right to risk their lives for things they think worth it. God go with you, my young man, but if they shoot you, remember, I warned you. I'll remember all right. Pumpkin had been a little stouter than Johnny. The uniform went on easily over the boy's breeches and jacket. Mrs. Bessie braided his hair for him and tied it tightly as the British regulars wore theirs. You couldn't say, could you? Scylla asked him. Why it is you have to get out tonight? Yes, Dr. Warren told me things to watch for and report onto him. I've got to find him. And Rab. Rab? The girl's voice sounded frightened. He was with the Lexington men. They stood up at dawn and the regulars killed quite a few of them. Oh, but Rab? Johnny did not answer immediately. He was sitting at the kitchen table and Mrs. Bessie was still fussing with his hair. Not once since Dr. Warren had left had he spoken his name. He hadn't dared to let himself begin thinking about him. If he did, he knew he could not think of anything else. Now he had spoken his name and emotion spheres that he had held in check all day surged up through him. But he quietly said, I've got to find him, so be a good girl, Syl, and mind Mrs. Bessie. He stood up and put on a shiny black hat with a silver cockade on it and saluted smartly. He knew that the last man to wear this uniform had been shot for putting it off, and there was a chance he'd get shot for putting it on. The scarlet tunic with its pale blue facings, the white crossbands on his chest, the white breeches made him feel like a different person. Now he was a private on the King's Own. He felt confident and happy. And Rab, of course, he was all right. You couldn't kill a fellow like Rab with just a handful of bullets. He shook hands with Mrs. Bessie, and because his uniform made him feel grown up, he kissed Scylla goodbye, just as he had the Sunday before seen Rab kiss his aunt. Not at all like a child being kissed by female relatives, but Scylla said mischievously, Why, I feel as if I were kissing Pumpkin. So Johnny stalked off down Beacon Hill with the proper martial strut. The littler they are, he thought, the more they strut. The physical act of strutting lifted his spirits, made him feel bigger than he was. Of course, that was why the little fellows do it, and he wondered what had happened to Sergeant Gale.